All right, shoot. Hello, folks. Welcome to Barbour Week 2, Barbour Chapter 2, the AmGov book, Chapter 2, that is. Um, Here discussing the United States founding. I've got about 30 slides here I'll try to get through, hopefully in about half an hour. Intro to the founding. Of course, what would become the United States was started as a colony of England, or of Britain. There were some pros to this, right? We overlooked this fact in high school when we learned the history of the founding of what would become the United States. But being a colony meant that the colonies were protected uh, by Britain, right? And Britain had an interest in populating the colonies and actually provided the means to get some people over from Europe, and then of course, Britain footed the bill, I'm sure, to bring enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa as well. Um, so, in the grand scheme of things, to explain how people got there, there we have it. Britain had a vested interest in protecting and cultivating the population of the colony. The people who lived in the colonies, though, however, were politically subject to the crown and economically dependent on it, and producers were denied access to lucrative markets, as all imperial powers do. They pretty much depend on colonies for wealth and raw materials, and then deny the colonies the means to trade with other places beyond the colonial power. So, producers in the colonies were definitely constrained by the fact that they were colonies, right? This is all due to the power of King George III. At the time, the ultimate political enforcer. And as the colonies sought to break free, we had obvious tension between what we call the divine right of kings. Right, most European powers were ruled by monarchs, and those monarchs thought themselves to be, pretty much instruments of the divine, and which explains why they were royalty. This, however, clashed head on with the new counter narrative that was a creation of the colonies, right? To create a counter narrative of a nascent democracy, right? And we saw in the first chapter of the AmGov book the importance of political narratives, right? But this counter narrative sought to create a separate political entity that would become the United States and would be a democracy. Why did the colonists want independence? The textbook points this out in somewhat juvenile terms: political reasons, economic reasons, and cultural reasons. Now, the reasons themselves aren't very juvenile, but directly from the text, from the introduction, political reasons include: you aren't the boss of us. Economic reasons: we'll make more money if we can compete with England, and England doesn't take its cut of our profits. True. It just doesn't sound very academic, we'll say. Cultural reasons: we have a new way of looking at government and power, and you, England, are stuck in yesterday's narrative. And that very simplistic text is very true, right? So the goal of the colonists was to create a new system, right? And that began with starting a new narrative, right? But this is a consequence of waking up to a worldview of individual rights and self-rule. We discussed last time, I believe, or chapter 1 talks about the importance of individualism in the U.S. political system, and this really began. I mean, this was present from the founding, right? So we need to develop an understanding of a social contract, right? And this is discussed in the text pretty straightforwardly. This notion of a social contract where the ruled consent to be ruled, but the power is ultimately held by those citizens, not by a monarch, right? And this is based on writings that go back to Thomas Hobbes in the 1500s, late 1500s into the mid 1600s. Hobbes was around. His quintessential work, The Leviathan, advocated that people needed to submit to a ruler in exchange for security. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and John Locke, or well, not quite, John Locke overlapped with Hobbes, I guess, a couple of few decades on this planet. But John Locke, writing in the late 1600s, shifted this from a mere drive for security to a system of laws, right? So we consent to be ruled in exchange for clear rules that will regulate our social arrangement, right, our political system. And this way of thinking led to the Declaration of Independence, which we have a quick summary. The skimmable Declaration of Independence is in the text. But four key takeaways here is that the Declaration was obviously written to create this political narrative. It claimed an inalienable rights of Americans, and that inalienable means not to be violated. And Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence. It's quite ironic that he talks of inalienable rights given to us by God, even though Thomas Jefferson himself was far from a believer, practicing Protestant of any identifiable stripe. Excuse me. The document itself blamed King George III for breaking the social contract. As the text points out, King George was probably completely unaware that any form of social contract in the democratic sense existed. And the author of our text, Christine Barbour, here claims that perhaps the signers of the Declaration of Independence should have blamed Parliament, which did exist by this time, but was subservient to the king. Important to realize, though, that the Declaration of Independence, its goals were to create a new country, a new political system, did not give citizenship to everyone who lived within that system, and we'll sort that out here in the coming slides. Let's think about, what does a constitution in general have to include? Well, a constitution generally maps out the functioning power and, most important for a democratic constitution, the limits of government, right? North Korea has a constitution. North Korea is far from a democracy. And its constitution is, which I have skimmed over once, doesn't really say much about the limits of government, whereas the Declaration, or sorry, the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, which failed, and we'll talk about why in a sec, and the current Constitution of the United States very clearly are concerned, both documents, with the limits of government, right? That should be the case in a democracy. To get there, both times around, the Articles of Confederation and the current Constitution required a lot of compromise, which is usually the reality in a democracy. So the Articles of Confederation formed the first new government of the United States, going back to 1777. Didn't last long, right? The Articles of Confederation. You remember, I'm sure you heard about the Articles in high school, but it created a very loose system of national government, which required all 13 states at the time to agree on any decision. This really doomed hope from Madison's notion of Republican virtue, which we talked about last time. This notion that individuals and individual states would be willing to sacrifice individual freedoms and liberties in exchange for this Republican creation, that's small r republic, but a union of states in which the states would work in the collective interest. This really didn't happen, which is the real reason why the Articles of Confederation, as Larson says here, crashed and burned, and the Articles were ultimately scrapped. Didn't work well because, by definition, the Articles of Confederation created a confederation. What do we mean by a confederation, and how does that differ from a federation? Right? We could easily call the current Constitution the Articles of Federation if we wanted to. A confederation is a looser union than a federation, right? And why was this such a loose federation or confederation? It was because the states were reluctant to give up power. In a confederation, really the units that make up the whole are stronger than the whole itself, right? Which is to say, states held more power than the central government. And thus the central government was really too weak, and it led to immediate economic and political instability in the early United States, right? There was no mechanism for the minting of national currency, so each state had its own currency. Each state had its own militia. So it was really hard to get the collective to work together, right? Which is why the Articles ultimately failed. It was easy for the European powers to place states off of each other, against each other, because each state really it was up to each state to create its own trade policy and foreign policy and so on and so forth. So anyway, the Articles failed, and so by 1787, 10 years after the Articles were first drafted, um, we saw a first round of real polarization in the United States, right? We talk about political polarization here all the time, like it's something new. It's actually not. Going back a couple hundred years and change, 240 or so years, we see, or 230 some years, we see the a real fissure between what we come to call the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were in favor of a stronger central government. The Anti-Federalists were against a stronger federal government, were actually more or less okay with the Articles of Confederation. The Anti-Federalists just wanted to tweak the Articles and move forward. The Federalists wanted to scrap the Articles and create a new constitution. But what allowed these two sentiments to really clash frontally here was the absence of a common enemy. By this point, the Revolutionary War was in the very recent history. And instead of having a common enemy to fight against, being the British Crown, we see fissures between colonists come to a head. So a few things to know about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, as I said a minute ago, wanted a stronger national government or stronger federal government. They tended to be representatives of large states. So, Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania. They preferred to get rid of the Articles, as I just said, and they favored the Virginia Plan, which at the time of the Constitutional Congress was a plan that advocated to create two chambers in the legislature, which we have now, right? But the makeup of both chambers of the bicameral legislature would be based on population. And taxes paid. So that would favor larger states, in other words, right? The Anti-Federalists were skeptical of a robust national government, again, preferred to tweak the Articles, tended to be representatives of smaller states, which included New Jersey at the time. And New Jersey put forth a plan called, curiously enough, the New Jersey Plan, which looked like, as the text says, a slightly upgraded Articles of Confederation with a single chamber of the legislature in which each state cast one vote, right? So small states would have the same one vote as larger states. And this system also proposed a weak executive and a non-existent court system, which pretty much looked like, again, the Articles of Confederation. As we know, if you know next to anything about the current U.S. Constitution, the New Jersey Plan was obviously not adopted. Well, we'll explain a little more as we move forward. The second source of polarization at the time was obviously tensions between the North and the South. And this boiled down to the question of counting population. Southern states, of course, wanted to use enslaved people to boost the population count if either of the chambers of Congress were going to be based on population of a state. Well, then Southern states definitely wanted enslaved people to count, even though, of course, no enslaved person, no women, and often in many states, no non-property holding men could vote, right? I mean, we obviously talk about inequalities along racial lines from the founding of this country, along gender lines upon the founding of this country, but we also overlook the fact that those without wealth were also pretty much left out of the decision-making process early on, right? You needed to hold property to vote, and not everybody did. So not all white men controlled all mechanism of power. You needed to be a white man who also held property, which obviously left out the interests of the impoverished in the system. But ultimately, ratification became possible because the North conceded to allow the Southern states to use 3/5 of an enslaved person, in effect, to count toward their total population. So 5 enslaved people counted for 3 humans for the purposes of determining representation in the House of Representatives. That's still in the U.S. Constitution today. I mean, it's been removed de facto in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, but the language is still there because the document it wasn't, officially changed. The text itself wasn't changed. But anyway, so that was needed though to get the southern states on board. So the founders finally agreed on a constitution. We done yet? Not exactly, right? The states needed agreement from 9 out of the 13 of them to ratify the document. And many of the anti-federalists, again from smaller states, weren't too keen on supporting ratification, right? So the anti-federalists were they needed to be won over, we'll put it that way, right? But unlike the Articles of Confederation, which required unanimity for any decision, even to ratify the U.S. Constitution, the bar was lowered to 9 of 13 states, right? Were there voices advocating for ratification? You betcha, right? And again, we know the political landscape was very different. The media landscape was entirely different. So what we had here were the Federalist Papers, which were a collection of 85 newspaper editorials published throughout the colonies that advocated in favor of the Constitution and thus its ratification, right? The Federalist Papers warned of political factions, which is a nice way of saying political parties, right? We think of political parties as very important to the functioning of today's democracy in the United States, but the founders, including George Washington on his way out the door after having served as the first president, advocated against them. But now we view them as necessary for the functioning of our democracy. But at the time, many voices who argued in favor of the U.S. Constitution advocated against the creation of parties, instead counting on the separation of powers and checks and balances to allow for political differences to be negotiated out within the federal government without the need for parties. The Federalists also provided a tepid endorsement of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was necessary, as we'll get to in a sec, to win support of the anti-federalists for the U.S. Constitution. The genius behind the Constitution, a lot of credit goes to James Madison, who really appreciated the role of self-interest in the functioning of the political system. There's good self-interest and bad self-interest, of course. Madison was influenced by seeing behavior under the Articles in which individual states could clearly act on their own self-interest. And since unanimity was required for all decision-making, this was a bad manifestation of self-interest. So Madison sought to design a system based on human nature, acknowledging self-interest, but as a motivator to bring about cooperation, right? He saw that the separation of powers into branches of government and providing for checks and balances within the system required each branch to jealously guard against the other branches, but knowing that nothing could move forward without the branches cooperating with each other, right? So that was how cooperation and compromise was further baked in to the federal system. Madison, again, understanding that institutionally, all the branches of government were also going to act in self-interest, no different than states would, and no difference really than individuals do, right? We all act in our own self-interest more often than not, right? Add to this the notion of federalism, right? Again, a stronger central federal government, but with power shared between that central government and the states, right? That was another notion that the founders had that would require more consensus, but without unanimity in the policymaking process, right? So what powers are we separating here? This will be the focus of the next section of the course after the first exam. We'll talk at length week by week about the legislative branch, which is Congress, the executive branch, which is the president, the judicial branch, which is the court system. And this is the system that was created, again, in 1787. And it's a system that still exists today, and it's a system that's been borrowed by other countries, which had not even existed prior to the United States. So, I'm not going to ever tell you that the U.S. political system is perfect. It's clearly not. But it's a system that's held its own for over 200 years, and it's a system that's been borrowed and copied by lots of other countries as well. So there must be something to it here. Continuing on, the founders, envisioned that a presidential system would be better to protect against abuses of power than a parliamentary system, right? So the distinction between a presidential and a parliamentary system is discussed I forget somewhere. Ooh, it's in section 2.5, I think, of the text here. But a presidential system is one in which a president in the executive branch, exists completely independently of the legislative branch, right? In a parliamentary system, your prime minister is in effect your head of the executive branch, functioning like a president would. But a prime minister is also the number one member of parliament, right? So, in a presidential system, the president exists, the office and the person, completely independent of the legislative branch, and they've got to work together, and they can be of different parties. In a parliamentary system, again, your head of the executive is also a member of parliament, right? Is also the number one member of parliament, and usually the party that controls the parliament thus names the prime minister, and the prime minister and the parliament work in tandem together. So you in effect have two branches of government that are totally aligned in their interests. So the idea that Madison had was, we're going to avoid this problem of one bad apple spoiling the bunch, right? If one branch is corrupted, the other two can preserve their integrity because they're independent of each other, right? So all in all, I mean, I see virtues in the parliamentary system, but the presidential system does provide, arguably, for more stability in that regard. It's also slower to change, which we'll talk more about in Chapter 3, and how that's a problem in the United States, how the lack of change, or the slowness of change, is one of the things that maybe is not one of the best features of the U.S. Constitution. But anyway, again, powers are shared under the Constitution among the three branches, and this pits self-interest against each other. There's a nice figure 2.2 in the text that gives you that breaks down visually the relationship among the judicial, legislative, and executive branches of government, and the checks and balances that exist among them. So anyway, but the founders had what Barbour here calls a Goldilocks problem. Right? We want to get the flexibility in the Constitution just right. The Supreme Court is the only court that's discussed in Article 3 of the Constitution. And again, we'll talk about that after the first exam. The Supreme Court has a role in interpreting the laws, but that really has evolved over time. But the Supreme Court has had a lot to do with how the political system and this Goldilocks question of getting things just right has evolved over time. And again, we'll talk about this as we move through the semester. But what I want you to know now, again, is that the Supreme Court is the only court that's mentioned in the Constitution. Everything else on down, district courts and appeals courts in the federal system, were created by Congress through legislation. And the whole notion of the Supreme Court's role in the political system has evolved over time as well. But the founders also made it very difficult to change the Constitution. Right? There's a small number of amendments for a reason. Only 27 amendments have passed the ratification system or process. In the history of the United States. 10 of them were in the Bill of Rights, so right out the chute. Two of them cancel out each other. The 18th Amendment bans alcohol. The 21st Amendment, thank sweet baby Jesus, made it legal again. So really only 25 amendments in practice exist, and 10 of those came about immediately after the Constitution was ratified. So really only 15 consequential changes to the Constitution since the late 1700s, right? So how does the amendment process work? Just to clarify quickly, requires two-thirds vote in both houses of Congress, or a national convention to discuss the amendment requested by two-thirds of state legislatures. So that's a pretty high bar. Getting two-thirds of Americans to agree on anything has always been tough. Then to ratify an amendment, you need 3/4 of the states to vote for that, either in their legislatures or by ratifying convention. So that's pretty tough, right? 2/3 and then 3/4 of the states to get an amendment passed. So that would explain why it hasn't happened very often, right? Let's shift gears and think about the role of federalism in this system. Section 2.6 of the chapter here. Federalism has proven to be pretty important, and many other countries have copied a federal system as well. have incorporated a federal system into their political systems. But it's been key to separate the powers between the federal government and state governments, right? This is born from the struggle over states' rights. And again, I mean, this was in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation really put states' rights and interests above that of the central government. And that didn't work, right? We realized 10 years into that system, or the founders, that didn't work. So federalism is yet another consequence of compromise, right? Reconciling the interests of state governments vis-a-vis the central government, right? So what are the constitutional provisions that have created federalism? There were enumerated powers of the Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, which included the necessary and proper clause, which gives Congress a lot of leeway to, in effect, make decisions that it needs to make in order to exercise its power, which sounds like that makes Congress pretty powerful over the states. And that's why the 10th Amendment was added in the Bill of Rights, the last amendment within the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed power to the states. The 10th Amendment basically says, in a nutshell, that anything not specifically granted to Congress as a power is retained to the states. So that's why the vast majority of the laws that affect our day-to-day functioning of life in this country are made at the state level. Right. The Constitution says nothing about traffic laws and nothing about education policy, nothing about professional licensures. All of these things are done at the state level, right? When you want a marriage certificate, it's issued by a county within a state. There's no federal marriage certificate, right? Because there's no mention of marriage in the document of the Constitution itself, right? So there's a balance there. That Congress has a lot of leeway, but there's a lot of policy area that states obviously have the power to legislate over that the federal government really does not. However, not so fast. The supremacy clause in the Constitution also makes it pretty clear that decisions of Congress carry a lot of weight over those of the states, and it's often when Congress says, "Hey, we have to make this law under the necessary and proper clause," states can challenge federal law in federal court, can go up all the way to the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court to decide the constitutionality of decisions made by Congress vis-a-vis the states, and really vice versa as well. So the supremacy clause is meant to allow Congress a lot of leeway in decision making over the states. Say Congress has the ability to legislate over anything that's interstate, particularly commerce, right? So states can't make their own trade policy between them. Congress can do that. That's part of the supremacy clause. So it's a balance. Like everything of this document is a balance. It's compromise. There are trade-offs, whether it's checks and balances among the three branches of government, or power balancing between the states and the federal government, right? So can we talk of like a new sibling rivalry, either among states or between the states and the federal government? I mean, it depends on your political point of view, I guess. If you're an inheritor of the anti-federalist way of thinking, then you might see it this way. But the document, the Constitution, provides for these two clauses here: the full faith and credit clause and the privileges and immunities clause. I'm not going to ask you to define these or write out definitions on the exam, but what these clauses are meant to do is ensure that states can't give privileges to their own citizens over citizens of other states. So like when I first moved to Texas, for example, I still had a Kansas driver's license. And until I got a Texas driver's license and registered to vote and such, I couldn't be treated as a second-class citizen because I wasn't a Texan, right? That's what the Constitution is meant to do. So, states must respect the decisions of other states. They must recognize my driver's license from Kansas, my marriage certificate from Nevada, so on and so forth, right? And not allow their own citizens special treatment. That was meant to avoid any sort of sibling rivalry among states, right? To soothe interstate tensions, right? So has it always worked? Not so much, right? We've got a nasty case of civil war that came about in the 1860s, so about 80 years after the Constitution was ratified. This was an attempt at states' rights narrative. and again, an assertion of particularly southern states uh, who were not happy about the federal government's attempt to abolish enslavement, right? So the Civil War was not uniquely about slavery or enslavement. It boiled down to states' rights, but in the backdrop in that debate was clearly, whether or not states could allow enslavement within their borders or not, right? So moving on here, uh, has federalism evolved over time? You betcha. The balance of power between states and the federal government has shifted. We've seen changes in interpretation of the Constitution. This is particularly done by the Supreme Court. We increasingly rely on the federal government in general, but the federal government in particular, and this has favored a shift in power toward the national government over states in practice, right? So, I mean, think about what happens when there's any sort of natural disaster, right? Earthquake, hurricane, massive tornado, where I come from. What do state governors do? They turn to the federal government and say, hey, help us out, give us some resources, right? This has naturally as well contributed to a shift of power toward the federal government. We can talk of points in time, precisely key moments in federal history that have led the federal government to assume more power in practice. Vis-a-vis the states, John Marshall as Chief Justice in the early 1800s. You don't need to take notes on this. I'm not going to ask you questions about this on the first exam. But John Marshall's name will come up when we get to the chapter on the court system, as he was the mastermind of a decision that allowed the Supreme Court to then decide the constitutionality of laws. And since then, for the last 200 plus years, the Supreme Court has consistently made decisions that were more favorable to the federal government vis-a-vis state power. The Civil War obviously was a shift of power toward the federal government as the federal government asserted itself over the southern states, the attempted confederation, the New Deal. Right, the president behind the New Deal was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose name will come up in the next batch of slides. But he's given a lot of credit for expanding or derided for expanding federal government again with the New Deal, and this in the aftermath of the Great Depression, and states really depended on federal government spending to get the collective U.S. economy out of the tank. In the 1930s, right? So beyond that, we can talk of broad interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk more about again in the next batch of slides for Chapter 3. This one took a long time to implement. This was meant to assure equal rights for the formerly enslaved. So the 14th Amendment came about during Reconstruction after the Civil War, but really has continued to take literally over 100 years to implement all the provisions of the 14th Amendment to ensure legally equal rights for all in the United States, regardless of race. But again, I say this one took a long time to implement, and we'll get there specifically in the next batch of slides for Chapter 3 on civil rights and liberties. So anyway, the status of the federal compromise today. This isn't 100% accurate, but we can view Democrats as tending to be advocates for national power. Thus, we can view the current Democratic Party of the United States as an inheritor of a federalist outlook on federal and state power, on federalism in general. Republicans are more similar to what were the anti-federalists at the time. Republicans today tend to be more in favor or more protective of states' interests vis-a-vis the federal government. And this battle for power between polarized parties has evolved, really boiling down to a basic fundamental view of the role of government in our daily lives. Right, the federal or Democrats tend to be less skeptical of federal government power, whereas Republicans tend to be, Democrats tend to be less skeptical of federal government power. Republicans more so. And thus Republicans tend to favor or view states' interests and rights as, at times in jeopardy vis-a-vis federal government power, right? And while Democrats tend not to be. And there we go, right? Ultimately, Democrats tend to view the government with less skepticism in general, more as an instrument to effectuate change for the better. Republicans tend to not have that view of government. Not all, but again, that's just one way to understand the Federalist Compromise today. But ultimately, it is worth reiterating, state policies hit us where we live, right? State policies are the ones that affect our day-to-day lives more so than federal policy and law, right? Policy is created and administered mostly at the state and local levels. And so thus, the state government is arguably much more important and much more present in our daily lives than the federal government. But it's worth this caveat here: federal funds often have a lot to do with what states can do, right? So states do depend on the federal government for a redistribution of tax dollars that we pay to the federal government that then come back to states. And the federal government has the authority to basically tell states what they can and can't do with federal dollars, right? States, when the federal government does nothing, states can do what they want. Congress can impose a policy goal on states, but wanting the states to maintain maximum control can provide block grants, which in effect come with the flexibility for states to spend money as they wish. Categorical grants come with more strings attached, that the federal government might say, hey, here's some money, but here's how you're going to have to use it. So these grants give far less autonomy to the states. But states still, are likely not going to turn a blind eye to federal money, although we have seen examples of this with redistribution of federal funds under the rubric of the Affordable Care Act, but that's another discussion for another day. Unfunded mandates are supposedly a thing of the past since the 90s, but it used to be that Congress could still tell states to do things, but provide no funds to offset the cost of administering the policy. And as you can imagine, our Republican friends, our anti-federalist friends, our states' rights friends are no fans of unfunded mandates, and that's why the Republican-controlled legislature in 1994 passed a law against them. But anyway, this is just to point out that states do have a lot of liberty and leeway vis-a-vis the federal government, but ultimately the federal government controls the purse strings. And ultimately, the federal government is often turned to by states when crisis occurs, even within states. So anyway, that's that. That's Barbour's Chapter 2. Appreciate your time and attention, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.